Thank you, first of all, everyone, for attending this session of the Helpline. This is a paper by a modern historian, and I am very grateful to all of you for coming to listen to it and for offering me, any criticisms or comment that you might want to offer. The chapter that I'm working on at present is the one that I have sketched out for you in this paper. It's a chapter that forms part of the book that I'm writing on Herodotus' reception since about 1500. And this book will hopefully interest Herodoteans like yourselves, of course, but also modern historians. So please pardon me if in the course of today's lecture, what I say is for you very old hat or seems to leave out crucial elements of the text or of 19th century reception. The reason it may seem to leave out some of the 19th century reception that is better known is that there are actually three other chapters in the book about the 19th century. The first of which is about source criticism and what I call hypercriticism. The second one is about liberal and Philhellenic narratives of the Persian Wars. And the third one is about Herodotus and 19th century Orientalism. But once I had drafted those chapters, I realized I had a lot of material left over, which I had collected under the rubric Herodotus and Race, most of it concerning Celtologists, Germanophiles, Etruscologists, Afrocentrists, and Slavophiles, all of whom went in search of their pre-Roman national histories in the later 18th and 19th century, and did so with Herodotus, rather than with Leopold von Ranke's beloved Thucydides as their guide. And I realized that the edges of the world needed to have their say. What they said, as you will see in the paper to follow, is virtually nothing about Thucydides or about the wars proper, and has instead to do with the search for the sources of Europe's pre-Roman antiquities, pre-Roman origins. The observations that undergird this chapter build on a realization that I came to in the course of my research for the larger book. Most of the readers of the histories, most of the time, did not care very much about the battles. The stories carried across the Middle Ages, when the Greek text of Herodotus was lost to the West, did not concern those battles. The first pictorial representation we have of Leonidas, at least labeled Leonidas, dates to 1496, but it's hard to find another before the French Revolution, and I still have only found one medieval image of Xerxes' bridge and not of any of the later books. The early modern period cared much more about stories such as the judgment of Cambyses, for example, a scene that was widely represented in paintings on Northern European town halls. Many of these were depicted for the sake of kind of civic governance. Or another favorite scene in the early modern period was the decapitation of Cyrus, a Rubens rendering of which remarkably hung next to the throne in the Salon d'Apollo from the time of Louis XIV to that of the French Revolution. Against the expectations we might have in reading, for example, Francois Hartog's Mirror of Herodotus, many Northern Europeans, from at least the time of Jean Baudin in the 16th century, considered themselves descendant of the Scythians and were actually not embarrassed by that. To be very blunt, most of these readers cared very little about the Greeks. Of great concern to them, by contrast, were the peoples who had inhabited the regions that were to Herodotus the edges of the world. And they were prepared to go to great lengths to find in the histories the foundations for the barbarian tales that they wanted to tell. Now, it may be a bit presumptuous of me to think that this audience would find this material interesting. It has little to do with serious scholarship written by classicists or Near Eastern experts, and the cast of characters will be largely unknown to you as they were to even me before I started digging. But I hope that this proves to be a lesson in the wider uses of at least this classic text in the modern world, among those who were desperate to hold on to its truth value. I believe these wider uses were part and parcel of the reason that Herodotus' readership far exceeded that of Thucydides in the 19th century, despite the latter becoming the darling of the Prussian historical profession. And these are just some Google engrams to give you a sense of just how much more read Herodotus was than Thucydides across at least the 4 languages I could use in Google engrams. There are many stories to tell, to be sure, but to keep our edges of the world inquiry from becoming almost unmanageably centripetal, I've chosen today to focus on 2 major groupings of readers, beginning with the Scots, Celts, Germans, and Russians, who drew extensive inspiration and evidence from Herodotus' Scythian logos. In the second part of the paper, I'll turn to another unexpected set of readers of the histories in the 19th century, African Americans. For the latter group, it was Herodotus' Egyptian logos that was most critical, but they too felt that they were recovering a lost history that needed to be juxtaposed to, if not to replace, the hypercritical and Roman-centric stories conventionally said to constitute real history. I've chosen these examples partly because the Scythians and Egyptians are the 2 peoples about whom, after the Persians and the Greeks, Herodotus says most. But I have the distinct sense that I'm sketching the tip of the edges of the iceberg, tip of the edges of the Earth iceberg. My book chapter also deals with the Pelasgians, and here is one of the 19th century's great renderings of that story. But we have no time for them today, and besides, the complexity of that question gives me and probably you a headache. So without further ado, let's tackle the Scythians. Now, I dare say that at a dinner party today, if one asked the question, who were the Scythians and what became of them, the result would be blank stares. But in early modern Europe, this was a question seemingly everyone was asking. Those who dealt with the question in a scholarly way knew very well what had been said about the topic by Homer, Hesiod, and the Hippocratic Corpus, and obliquely said in the Hebrew Bible. Experts also knew the work of the medieval writer Herodotus, himself a Goth, who made the Goths descendant of the Scythians, or Getae, though there was also a tradition ramped up by Pope Pius II in the mid-15th century, which identified the Scythians with the Turks, then menacing the civilized world of Europe itself. Many nasty things were said, to be sure, about Scythian savages. But remarkably strong, too, was the ancient tradition stretching back to Ephorus amongst the Greeks and Horace amongst the Romans, which rendered the Scythians stoic innocents, their physical strength honed by natural hardships, and their souls saved from over-civilization. During the age in which the Ottomans menaced Europe from the east and Western princes figured themselves as descendants of Adam, Aeneas, or the Rome-conquering Franks, most did not wish to associate themselves with Scythian barbarians. Herodotus' information was known and used especially by geographers trying to get to grips with his Scythian square. And here are just 2 of the many early modern maps attempting to put Scythia in place. But most of those who thought about the Scythians did so in terms set by Horace or Strabo, or on the other hand, by Ovid and Christian church fathers who considered them vile barbarians. That is to say, they used later sources in preference generally to Herodotus. Until the early 17th century, however, few were brave enough to depart from the biblical narrative sufficiently to ask tough questions about European descent from Adam and the sons of Noah. Arguments broke out about which language had been spoken in paradise, however, in the 16th and the 17th century. Some said Hebrew, a few Poles thought it was Polish, but Dutch humanists pioneered what would be called the Scythian hypothesis, which designated the Scythians rather than the Hebrews as the fathers of almost all of the European nations. They conjectured that the Scythian language, whatever it was the mother language of all modern European tongues. This insight inspired Leibniz, and in the 18th century led to a massive speculations about the Scythians' descendants, most especially the Goths and the Celts. Confusion was still rife in the 1730s, when the Stoic Scythians tradition was re-energized by Jansenist Spartophiles such as Charles Rollin and Rousseauvian fans of noble savagery. And then, again, and perhaps most importantly, by the Scottish Highlanders and their fans, especially after the loss of the 45 uprising, ushered in a new period of Celtic Romanticism. Indeed, we start our story in Scotland, definitively an edge of the European, if not enlightened world, where James Macpherson, better known as the forger of the Ossian poems, provoked a fight by claiming that the barbarian Celts were the great founders of European civilization and the fathers of most Western European languages, while the Goths and the Slavs were late arriving and backwards destroyers. Now, Macpherson did not make his claims on Herodotean evidence. Indeed, Herodotus' information on the Celts is thin and not helpful for his cause. But our Greek historian made a dramatic entrance in the 1787 violently anti-Celtic riposte of the poet and antiquarian John Pinkerton, who was coincidentally also a forger of ancient Scots poetry. Pinkerton claimed that the Scythians had become Goths, and most Scotsmen, other than vile Highlanders, were Goths. What is remarkable about Pinkerton was not just his prejudices, but his much greater interest in delving more deeply into the European prehistory by establishing a sturdy Central Asian foundation based on trusting the earliest ancient authorities. In trying to excavate the linguistic questions of the present, Pinkerton wrote, he had found that, quote, instead of a foundation, I did not even have good grounds for a foundation, owing to the carelessness with which the origins of nations has been treated. I have had to drain my ground of much watery falsehood, end of quote. To this end, Pinkerton milked Book 4 of the histories for the earliest linguistic, geographic, and ethnographic data, hoping to demolish all Celtic claims to civilization. The secret, he said, was to trust ancient authorities rather than modern rationalists or Pyrrhonists. The truth, he underscored, is always old, end of quote. Pinkerton's erudite polemics provoked much more scholarly investigation of this issue as the Scythian question morphed gradually into the Indo-European one. The debate culminated in the reconciliatory work of another Scot, J.C. Pritchard, who in 1831 provided a widely accepted proof that the Celts were, in fact, Scythian Europeans after all. Now, where Pinkerton and the Scots led into the shadowy world of the Scythians themselves, others followed, including the Czech linguist Pavel Josef Šafarik, a Herderian Slavophile whose contributions to Slavic studies fueled the Slavic revolts of 1848 and earned him the nickname the greatest Slav of the 19th century. Šafarik was educated partly at Jena, where his romantic patriotism was reinforced by reading Herder, and where he resolved to try to put Slavistic on a scientific, meaning philological basis. His multi-volume Slavic Antiquity, published in Czech in 1837, was a vast archive of Slavic history and literature, both massively erudite and fired by a cause to show that the Slavs were not a new people appearing after Alexander, but the first Indo-European settlers of most of Europe. They were not Scythians, but descendants of the Scythians' blue-eyed, non-Scythian-speaking neighbors, the Budini, described in a key Herodotean passage that would be extensively deployed by many 19th century writers and races. To accommodate modern geography, Šafarik moved the homeland of the Budini to the west side of the Don and identified the marshland described, let's see, that was not the right slide, and identified the marshland described in the passage with the Rokino swamps, and then the entire territory of White Russia and Volhynia. As part of this evidence, he cited the many place names in the region which suggested Budini foundings. And I think this is where that material is shown. Buda, Budaki, Budana, Budaviki, Budnica, and etc. He also deployed a passage from the histories at 3.115, testifying to Northern Europe's amber trade. Despite Herodotus' serious doubts, he identified the Eridanus River with the Dnieper, which then allowed him to establish the settling of the Slavic Wends beyond the Carpathians before the Goths arrived. So we're getting up under Roman, under Gothic history to establish the primacy of the Slavs. No wonder Soporic identified the age of Herodotus as the beginning of the, quote, always and still fragmentary and dark history, quote. It was only on Herodotus he could build the crucial foundations for the great antiquity and territorial expansiveness of the first Slavs. Now, Soporic's work made Prague, in the words of one commentator, a Slavic Mecca, and his Slavic antiquities was quickly translated into German, Russian, and Polish. But it was probably unknown to Munich professor Kaspar Seuss, who in 1837 published his own massive treatise entitled The German Tribes and Their Neighbors. Seuss pulled many of the same passages as Soporic on the amber trade and the Budini, but with the purpose of showing that the Budini were not related to the Slavs, but to the Persians on the front end and the Germanic Alani on the back end. Here, Seuss picked up a few other key passages, including the one which states the Medes had originally called themselves Arioi, and several others which gave him grounds to argue that the Scythian belief in the gods and in fire worship was the same as that of the Persian Medes and of the Germans. Seuss was following the now fleshed out lines of what he called the Indo-German rather than the Indo-European language tree, but one with all the emphasis on the Scythian, Persian, Germanic linkages, leaving aside the Celts and Slavs. But it was Jakob Grimm's History of the German Language of the later 1840s that clinched the Scythians' Indo-German credentials. Grimm scrutinized Scythian terms reported in the histories and other classical texts and deemed the language and therefore the people indubitably Indo-German. Grimm's evidence and authority convinced linguists of the day, including the influential comparative philologist Karl Mühlenhoff. In the 1870s, Karl Mühlenhoff produced a series of influential essays wrestling with the 60-odd Scythian terms to be found in the histories. He concluded that the Scythians were of Iranian descent and formed the basis of the last Aryan migrations into Europe, that of the early Germans. The Slavs, by contrast, for Karl Mühlenhoff, were not an Indo-European people, but descendants of the more truly barbaric and cannibalistic tribes Herodotus made indigenous to the northern Pontic steppe. I ought to note here the clash of these theories with even older ones about the Poles' descent from the Sarmatians. So this was my map just showing you where where Soporic moved the location of the early Slavs in order to line up with Herodotus's supposed map. An even older theory that linked the Poles' descent to the Sarmatians, who they refused to identify with the truly barbaric Scythians. So the Sarmatians in the Polish reading are not actually Scythians. This tradition was probably medieval and seemed to assimilate Roman reports of this fierce tribe with a biblical descendant of Japheth named Lech. The main aims of the theory seem to have been to differentiate the Poles from the Russian Scythians on the one hand and the Goth Germans on the other, but the key value promoted by this myth of origins was that of absolute freedom for the Polish nobility, the Szlachta, and their pre-Roman control of northeastern Central Europe. They too like to figure themselves as stoic, manly, violent warriors, wisely, and leaving aside, as far as I know, the Amazon piece of the story in favor of this very masculine image. The myth was was rather less dependent on Herodotus than the Scythians, but when in the 19th century it was vital to delve beneath the Roman surface, Herodotus was also used by Sarmatian writers when possible to shore up differences rather than similarities within the Scytho-Iranian family. As the Roman surface cracked, then Herodotus came more and more to the aid of new claimants to the title of Europe's first civilizers. Maps were more thoroughly historicized and detailed. Of course, no single ancient source could answer all the questions, and at mid-century, Slavic, Russian, and Germanophile experts enhanced their specialized linguistic work with what Adolf Pictet called linguistic paleontology. Linguists were called to identify the oldest names for trees, animals, and customs, and then to juxtapose these findings on a contemporary landscape that, thanks to increased travel, was now much better known. Medical anthropology and racial science also came in here to match ancient and contemporary somatic figures. But material evidence was only salient when it could be matched to ancient texts, and thus Herodotus' testimony continued to be vital. As the Indo-European question evolved into Aryan racial history, Herodotus' Scythian logos continued to resonate. The Aryanist anthropologist Theodor Posch, for example, combined Herodotus' Budini passage with a Russian medical treatise on albinoism, endemic in the Pripyat marsh area, where conveniently there were also otters and beavers. Identifying further the Eridanus with the Dnieper, Posch was able to identify a European homeland for the Aryans, which ran along what he called the, quote, chief waterway of the blonde race. Working with another set of Herodotean evidence, the anthropologically inclined Johannes Fressel in the Scythian Sakians, ancestor of the Germans of 1886, added ethnographic to the linguistic proofs of his thesis. For Fressel, the wearing of pants and furs, the cooking of flesh in kettle, the presence of legends about the griffins, later to morph into dragons, and gold, the reverence for the god of war, provided clear signs of the common origins of the Scythians and the early Germans. Grimm and Muhlenhoff had been overly critical of Herodotus, Fressel concluded, but thanks to their work and his own, quote, we are now in the position to verify Herodotus in the most glorious way, end of quote, and to give the Germans a prehistory that had been too long obscured and sidelined. Study of Herodotus' Scythians in Imperial Russia was an even bigger business, as more and more archaeological remains streamed into the Hermitage over the course of the 19th century, and the search for the origin of the Slavs intensified. Caspar Meyer has beautifully described the ways in which these studies elevated Russian pride, drawing on a long tradition of primitivist praise for the Scythians and also helping to legitimize the use of Herodotus reports. The beautiful metalwork unearthed in the Kurgan tombs demonstrated that if the early Slavs had lacked Parthenons and philosophical treatises, these hardy, simple folk were no mere barbarians, and that just as much as the ancient Mediterranean, southern Russia had served as a Eurasian cultural crossroads. Some of the greatest Russian historians and art historians of the fin de siècle, including the young Mikhail Rostovtsev, devoted themselves to the study of this Eurasian crossroads, where the origins of Gothic and medieval art and proto-Christian Hellenistic religions were said to lie. Although increasingly these authors wrote in Russian rather than in French or Latin, Western readers were acquainted with Russian findings, which tended to ratify Herodotus, by way of some important French translations, as well as the massive survey by Alice Minns of 1913, which offered 351 illustrations of Scythian burial sites and gold ornaments, and a full 15-page bibliography of recent Russian publications on the subject. And Rostovtsev ended up with a professorship at Yale and major publications in English, bringing the Herodotean edges of the earth to an admiring post-war world. Okay, we now move to part 2, the Egyptian question. Let us not forget the power of material culture as proof as we turn to our second very different case, the very vexed and still heated debate over race in the histories concerning the Egyptians. In this long-running controversy, no passage was more important, of course, than Herodotus 2.104, in which Herodotus described the Egyptians whose descendants he met in Colchis on the Black Sea in a way typically translated in the 18th and 19th centuries as black-skinned and woolly-haired. The credibility of this passage was enhanced by 3 things. First of all, Herodotus here was an eyewitness. Secondly, he also documented the proof of Egyptian circumcision, which they shared with the ancient Israelites, a passage that had been beloved by biblical critics for centuries. And thirdly, other recent findings by travelers, such as James Bruce, who ratified his claims about a westward course of the Niger, rather than the Nile, but still the westward course of a river in Egypt, gave writers increasing confidence that Herodotus knew his stuff. That Herodotus had seen Black Colchians was not in dispute. Even J.F. Blumenbach, the racial anthropologist who classified Egyptians amongst the Caucasians, still believed that he had done so, that Herodotus had seen Black Egyptians, and he speculated on skin color changes over the centuries due to climate and temperature. But the question came to public attention in the wake of the claims of the enlightened radical, the Comte de Volney, who had actually been to Egypt, that his viewing of the Sphinx had convinced him of Herodotus' veracity. And Volney writes, that is, that the ancient Egyptians were true Negroes of the same species with all of the natives of Africa, and they have retained the imprint of this original mold, even though one can explain after mixing their blood for so many centuries with the Greeks and the Romans, they have lost the intensity of their first color. This fact opens up space for philosophical reflection to consider that this race of Black men, today our slaves and the objects of our contempt, is the one to which we owe our arts, sciences, and even the use of speech itself. End of quote. This extremely widely known and quoted passage would be, first of all, cited and paraphrased by Henri Gregoire, radical priest and abolitionist in 1810, and by generations of Black activists ever since. From the beginning of the abolitionist press in 1827, writes Margaret Malamud, quote, Black newspapers featured articles asserting the influence of Egypt on Greece and Rome to argue against widespread white assertions of Black racial inferiority, end of quote. Herodotus from the beginning was central in making this case, but we must not forget that Volney was already adding the monuments and physiognomic evidence into the database deemed vital for writing ancient prehistory. The further intrusion of anti-environmentalist anthropologists into the discussion made the search for evidence to fact-check Herodotus' Egyptian passages ever more vital. In 1813, the British doctor and proto-anthropologist J.C. Pritchard cobbled together Bloombachian skull measuring, the latest British work on India, classical scholarship, and late enlightened Egyptology to produce his extremely widely read treatise, Researches into the Physical History of Man. Pritchard believed that Herodotus' testimony at 2.104 and also at 7.70, where he argued that the Eastern Ethiopians or Indians were also dark, had straight hair, were central for Pritchard. He concluded from these facts and from the main similarities between Egyptian and Babylonian culture, for which of course he also drew on Herodotus, that mankind had originally been Black. But in a proto-version of Darwinian sexual selection, humans, according to Pritchard, had whitened as aesthetic tastes improved. By this tortuous reasoning, Pritchard managed to retain some version of a noetic diffusionary story, rendering our ancient ancestors vile and ignorant, but preserving their African descent. Pritchard's main evidence for this diffusionary story was anatomical, ethnographic, and textual, but he also noted preciously that if the hieroglyphics were to be deciphered, sculpture and painting will acquire a degree of importance that we are at present not able to appreciate. 1 second, I left the text of the rest of the paper on the computer printer, so I will pause briefly while I find that. Apologies. Pritchard's evidence came from anatomical and textual sources as well as ethnographic ones, but he noted presently that if hieroglyphics were to be deciphered, sculpture and painting, quote, will acquire a degree of importance that we are at present not able to appreciate. His own Egyptian mythology of 1819 contained only 6 Black and white engravings, and was in any case concerned with religion rather than race. By the 1830s, however, the improvement of print technologies, as well as the expansion of Egyptian travel and collections, put more illustrations into circulation, making for new forms of racial proof. Here, the publications of the the Italian Egyptologist Ippolito Rossellini were especially crucial. And this is some material I've just been working on, I find really fascinating. Rossellini's I Monumenti dell'Egitto e della Nubia, the first volume of which appeared in 1832, included a number of colored plates, most importantly, a series showing the Egyptians and foreigners as depicted in monuments Rossellini had seen at Memphis. These monuments, as we shall see in a moment, would play a very important role in later racist as well as Afrocentric literature aimed at using the Egyptians' own self-images against Herodotus' text. In 1837, goaded by abolitionist advocacy, the American pro-slavery Dr. Samuel George Morton took up the question of the racial history of the ancient Egyptians. Morton, who had already written about the racial profile of Native Americans based on an analysis of skulls, commenced a correspondence with G.R. Glidden, vice consul in Cairo, which resulted in the delivery to Morton of several dozen Egyptian skulls. Glidden was himself keenly interested in racial questions, and in a letter of 1841, he wrote to Morton of his conviction that the monuments did not support Herodotus' claims. We, he wrote, as hieroglyphics, he did not actually know hieroglyphics, but nonetheless, know Egypt better now than all the Greek authors or the Roman, end of quote. He had already seen Rossellini's images, and he believed they would prove that the Egyptians were not Black. Morton concurred, and in his Crania Egyptiaca, concluded that Herodotus was completely wrong about the question of ancient Egyptian phenotypes, offering Rossellini's images as proof. And if you look at the source of those images, it's all from Rossellini. The Egyptians might have been darker skinned than the Greeks, but they were Caucasians and not Black Africans, whatever the ancients said about them. Morton's skull measurements unleashed a flurry of similar denunciations of Herodotus' claims, including a furious passage in one of the most influential racial treatises of the century, Glidden and Knott's Types of Mankind of 1854. The authors packed this work with erudite charts as well as 350 woodcuts meant to shore up arguments based on skull measurements, comparative philology, and the Bible. Rossellini's colored images were especially crucial, and you see some of those here, reproductions of the wall paintings, and then a kind of synthetic comparison of types in the center, and then on the far right, the use of those images in the Glidden and Knott Types of Mankind. I was unable to find a modern photograph of these wall paintings, but examining other images from the tomb of Seti I does not suggest to me that Rossellini's artist Angelelli, who made a close study of ancient paints, seriously distorted the vibrant color of these Egyptian images. Oops. We'll go back to this. But Rossellini's isolation of the types certainly did give Morton and company fodder for their claims. Thanks especially to their well-publicized scientific efforts, quote, by mid-century, as one commentator has noted, the view that the ancient Egyptians had been Black was definitively a minority position. While their skull measurements seem not to have been especially convincing, the argument from the monuments did give the racial anthropologists useful Egyptian testimony, which allowed them to render Herodotus' account simply that of a fabulating or uninformed Greek. But this is hardly the end of the story. For African-American writers, too, had learned from Volney, Gregoire, and Prichard that in Herodotus they held a possible trump card. Although it was much more common for African-American writers to draw on Roman or biblical history, Greek history, especially after the Greek War of Independence, seemed to offer a means to contest racial inferiority and put Black persons back into history. Edward Wilmot Blyden who served at various times as both professor of classics and of Islamic studies at Liberia College, certainly knew and loved the Egyptian and Ethiopian passages of Herodotus, trustworthy because he was an eyewitness on the subject of Egyptian hairstyles and skin colors and the beauty of the Ethiopians. In an 1869 essay entitled The Negro in Ancient History, Blyden argued that the monuments did not give the full story. Herodotus passages also about the noble king of the Ethiopians, who had given Cambyses a, quote, straightforward, brave, and truly Christian answer, end of quote, similarly documented the remarkable ancestry of Black persons who had been such great benefactors of mankind. Blyden's conclusion was that American Blacks needed to return to Africa and build there a Christian African empire. Had they done so, unquestionably, this empire's father of history would have been Herodotus. Blyden bequeathed his reading of Ethiopian history to numerous later Black scholars, including William Leo Hansberry, professor at Howard University from 1922 to 1959. Displeased by the skeptical attitude to subjects like his own, sown by the, quote, Wolffian school of classical criticism, Hansberry claimed that those who had kept faith with Herodotus, quote, have greatly extended our own knowledge of Ethiopian history, end of quote. His French contemporary, Cheikh Anta Diop, turned the whole business into a conspiracy. His Nation Nègre et Culture of 1954 opened with a lengthy defense of the probity and critical acumen of Herodotus, asking, quote, why seek to discredit such a historian to make him seem like a naive? Why refabricate history despite his explicit evidence, end of quote. The answer was modern Egyptologists had not improved knowledge, but had perverted ancient truths. For Diop, one of the leading Afrocentric thinkers, Africans needed to understand and repossess the true history of civilization as conveyed by ancient textual witnesses. And to do so meant rejecting the claims of all of those who had labeled Herodotus a naive, and quite remarkably, mashing up Rossellini's images for his purposes. And you see the paperback of Diop's book, which actually uses those very same Rossellini images. In fact, if we look closely at 19th century European authors, as well as American abolitionists, many of them too retained a healthy respect for Herodotus' claims. Many, like the Dutch painter Lawrence Alma Tadema, incidentally a great friend of the liberal Egyptologist Georg Ebers, hedged their bets by deciding that at least some non-enslaved Egyptians had been Black, or at least African. In 1895, the Italian anthropologist Giuseppe Segre argued that all of Europe was of Libyan stock, though descendants of the fair-skinned Africans. His claims were founded in the first instance on yet another passage from Herodotus' Book 4, as well as, once again, illustrations from Rossellini. Based on this information, Segre refuted recent claims made by the British Egyptologist Matthew Flinders Petrie that the most ancient Egyptians had migrated from the Near East. Instead, Segre claimed they came from Libya, where they mixed with Black Ethiopians. Thus, the Egyptians, according to Segre, quote, belong to the Mediterranean stock and are of African origins, end of quote. This was Segre's own Mediterranean-centered rebuttal to the Northern European Aryanism that had given credit to the North or East for Southern Europe's ancient civilizations. Segre's The Mediterranean Race was translated into German in 1897 and into English in 1901 with an American edition in 1909, and was sufficiently infamous in Italy to be hotly debated by fascist writers in 1942. Now, although Arthur Evans was keen to establish the Cretan's superior cultural creating ingenuity to that of the Egyptians and other Near Eastern cultures, he did agree with Segre that the Mediterranean, not the North or the Persian East, should be credited with laying the foundations for European civilization. In a much-cited paper of 1912, he reiterated, quote, the people who we discern in the new dawn are not the pale-skinned Northerners, but essentially the dark-haired, brown-complexioned race, end of quote. Evans' work had little to do with Herodotus, but the introduction of the Minoans and the Cretan crossroads into this picture contributed to the steady decline of Aryan theories, of course, accepting Aryan races. And then there came Diop, as we have seen, followed 2 decades later by the most controversial of Herodotus' recent champions, Martin Bernal. A quick survey of his Black Athena reveals not only that chapter 1's epigraph is from the histories, but that virtually the whole of his ancient model, which he alleges with some reason in my view was thrown out in the 1820s for racist reasons, is derived from Herodotus. I seriously doubt whether we can or should in the end solve the question of the race of the ancient Egyptians, as it comes down to a standoff between the textual and the material evidence. But we can be sure that debates on the question of the future will never fail to make the father of history a key witness or culprit. Some conclusions. As this paper has shown, despite numerous challenges to Herodotus' veracity and attacks on his naivete launched by mid-century classical historians, the histories remained for some a highly trustworthy and useful text. Sometimes this was because there was little else as ancient or as fulsome as his ragbag of factoids, or as in the case of writings on Egypt, because new scholarship seemed biased and in need of ancient correctives. For this group of readers, it was not sufficient to be simply agnostic about pre- or proto-literary periods, even if that meant coloring outside the lines drawn by philological hypercritics. Nor would they have been content to read analyses of Greek forms of othering of the nations on their periphery. Our actors instead set off in search of the true history and ancestry of the Scythians, of the ancient Egyptians, and so on, with Herodotus as their guide. None of these seekers found exactly what they were looking for, the origin of these Slavs, for example, and many made the terrible mistake of drawing racist or fanatically nationalist conclusions. But by actually trying to know more, they expanded the realm of knowledge far beyond its previously imagined borders, using Herodotean dynamite to blast holes in that Roman surface that could never be patched again. Thank you.